Welcome to Prep My Art and Prep My Art Academy. We're so happy to have you viewing today. We are with an incredible guest. We're here with Dr. Tristan McKay. I'm going to tell you a little bit about him. He is a pianist, an educator, a scholar based in Detroit, Michigan. He's celebrated for his dynamic and assertive playing by the New York Times. He has premiered dozens of new solo and chamber works, including venues at Carnegie Hall in New York. He's also performed at the Apollo Theater, the Chamber Music Society at Lincoln Center. How do we say this one?
Roulette.
Roulette, the Stone, and many more places. He has over 20 years of teaching experience and currently runs a thriving virtual piano studio for students of all ages. His prize-winning students have received state awards and regional gold medals from the Royal Conservatory of Music, as well as outstanding marks from local competitions and festivals. I'll have all of Tristan's bio and information linked for you below. So Tristan, we have a really cool topic today, and that is on articulation.
Yes, articulations.
What on earth is articulation?
So articulation is, I usually describe it as how we play a note. So we might think about playing a note detached or staccato or smoothly connected legato. And we really can think about articulation with every single note that we play in a piece.
Yeah. So a lot of it's about the way that you are physically approaching your touch, like your attack and your release to the piano, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And articulations really just mesh together with a lot of other ways we talk about playing with dynamics and character and tempo and energy and all of that.
Yeah. So how do you approach your articulations? Do you approach it different with each time period? Because what I'm thinking is, we've got a lot of middle school and high school students and parents who have no idea that their students even need to be aware of these things. And they may have great teachers, but not all teachers are actually thoroughly diverse in this stuff. I met a teacher who's taught for years and she wasn't even aware of, in Bach, I believe it's if the interval is larger than a fourth, it's supposed to be detached.
Yeah, and that's a really great question. So articulations really do change depending on what time period you're playing from. So it's sometimes difficult to make these sort of broad generalizations, but it's true. In a work from the Baroque period, we might approach things really differently. We talk a lot about playing with a detached touch. And this isn't just a random uh, sort of thing that we decided one day to do. It has a lot to do with the overall style of works that were found or created during the Baroque period. It also has a lot to do with the instruments that these were performed on. So a lot of works by Bach were originally composed for the harpsichord or for the organ. So we can consider how those instruments would sound with that repertoire and take that into account when we think about articulations on the piano.
Yeah. So how would a student even find more resources on that?
So I always recommend listening to a lot of recordings. So if you are working on a piece, on a Baroque piece, or if you're doing an exam like the Royal Conservatory of Music, these might be your list A pieces from that. Definitely listen to recordings and listen to several recordings.
Right.
So
and quality recordings.
quality
So
recordings too.
maybe Naxos, Naxos, they have quality recordings. If they're using the Royal Conservatory repertoire, they have all of the recordings you can access through a code in the back of the book that you've purchased. Do you have any other suggestions of where you can find some quality recordings? Not just YouTube, because anybody can play and post on YouTube. Doesn't mean they're playing it well.
That's true. If you have Spotify, if you have Amazon Music, if you have any of those music streaming services, you can absolutely find quality recordings on there. But if you're not sure about a recording, you can always check with your teacher, or you can do a quick Google search and just see if this is an artist who has some kind of track record as a professional concert pianist and recording artist.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've talked a little bit about Baroque. What are some stylistic articulations that students need to be aware of for Baroque repertoire?
It's a great question. So one of the main things that comes up, you mentioned already, it's the detached note. And I do this because that's sort of the attack that you want to take with those notes. And a lot of the time, this might reference the sound of the harpsichord, which has a very detached sound, generally speaking, just because sound is created in a completely different way than on the piano.
It's like a plucking sound.
Absolutely.
Like you're pulling it instead of descending into the note, you're pulling it.
Exactly. And so
It's more lifted.
if you've ever opened up a grand piano and looked inside and seen the hammers hitting the strings, we have a lot of control over the attack on the piano. We can play something softly, we can play loud, depending on how much force or how quickly we play the note, however you'd like to think about that. But on the harpsichord, it's true, when you play a note, we can't really control the dynamic based on how we press that key. And it's because of that mechanism. There aren't hammers coming up and hitting the strings. There are little jacks that jump up and pluck the strings.
Mm-hmm.
And that creates a very different sound, which we can imitate and try to capture on the piano with that detached articulation.
Right. And having that imagery in mind that that's the sound that you're trying to achieve. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I find that's a big part of capturing articulations overall, is really imagining, having an idea of what that sound feels like or looks like if you're a visual person.
Yeah.
So
when we're talking about articulation, what about tying in your dynamics? For like Baroque, we would use trace dynamics sometimes.
yeah, so generally speaking, in Baroque music, I always recommend that my students keep articulations consistent across the piece. So if you're playing a work by Bach, let's say if you're playing a prelude or fugue, and you've decided that in this piece, based on recordings, based on conversations with your teacher, based on your own personal interpretation, if you've decided to make eighth notes more detached, you want to keep that consistent all the way through.
That's good.
And that can mesh with dynamics sort of in a similar way. We want to be consistent with those decisions and really intentional too.
Yeah. So how about the classical time period? So the Baroque is like the 1600s. Classical, we're more in the 1700s. What kind of articulations are we going to want to aim for in there?
Yeah, so moving into the classical period, we see a rise in the galant style. We might think of it as very smooth, connected, legato, maybe some Alberti bass going on.
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of the time we have that sort of touch or articulation, but really the whole thing is open. So we can absolutely have detached notes, we can have staccato, accented notes. And there's some really great pieces in the classical canon where you can explore articulations.
Like what? What's some of your favorites?
Mozart's Fantasy in D minor. Incredible piece to explore articulations with. Almost every page feels like a different piece. We move through so many different scenes. It's almost like Mozart composed an opera on the piano, and we get to meet all of these different characters, and a lot of them pop out through articulations.
Wow.
So it's a great piece.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very cool. Very cool. What about for some of the younger students or the ones who are newer to Mozart? Maybe level like 5, 6, 7-ish?
Yeah, I would always recommend checking out, if you do the Royal Conservatory of Music or not, you can access the syllabus online and you can find just a wealth of repertoire at all different levels.
Mm-hmm.
So it might be Mozart, it might be a Beethoven piece, but again, that's one of the great things about working with a curriculum like that, is we can start to talk about these things that are unique to each time period right from the start, pretty much.
Yeah, I think one thing that stands out to me is the two note slurs.
Absolutely.
You know, you always have like that down, up, down, up, down. You know, you have to be really consistent with those and also unique with each one, especially if you have multiple in a row, because we would never say the same thing the same way twice. So you always have to make the first bunch louder than the second or softer and then louder, but you have to vary your dynamic, but you would still keep your articulation consistent.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. It's there can be so many things going on at once within a passage, or or even a single measure. So thinking about how we can really mesh together articulations with dynamics, I think it should be part of the conversation and part of the learning process pretty early on.
Absolutely.
I know some teachers like to wait almost until, well, maybe not the end of the learning process, but certainly until after notes are learned, until after rhythms are mastered, and even dynamics and pedal are added. If you're playing a piece with pedal, some teachers wait until all of that is done before talking about articulations. And it really isn't the best way to go, I think, because we miss out on so much.
Yeah, pedaling really should be the very last thing they would do, because you can make your piece too muddy sounding, too thick with tone, and blurring your textures and your harmonies. But articulations, really, you should do, beat by beat and then measure by measure, and learn it accurately the first time, right? So then you can layer upon layer. It's a lot when you're looking at all the notes and you're like, oh, I have all this stuff to do for my exam, and but I think that I agree with you. We should teach articulation pretty much right away. It gives you that character.
Yes, it gives you that character, and even things that seem really basic, like fingerings. Right. I mean, if we're not doing the correct articulation or the one that you decide to work on,
you won't have fluent finger numbers attacking, and you'll get all jumbled up, and then you'll be memorizing it wrong, and then
right. And we can actually choose fingerings to really help reveal articulations or just add them in a more natural way. So you mentioned the two note slur that comes up a lot in classical period music. You might choose a fingering from the start that lets you add a natural accent to those two note slurs without really having to work extra to get that effect.
Well, yeah, because different fingers are heavier naturally. So if you have something you want to have like a 3-4, or even a 2-3, and you can control your release. 2-3, I think, is a lot.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. So what about the romantic time period?
Yes. So a favorite of many, the romantic period. We see a lot of exploration of resonance and of use of the pedal. We see composers really starting to explore new extremes of loudness and softness. Okay, I'm talking about dynamics, but with articulations, it's really the same thing. So we see even more intense accents. We see even longer passages with staccato. We see lots of really interesting explorations of articulations for the purpose of exploring some pretty interesting and extreme characters.
Right. And one of the reasons why is because at that point in the 1800s, the piano went from being made 400 times a year to being 400 times a day. They would be able to make a piano. No?
Oh, no, it's amazing.
Yeah, no, it was. And it became a value, like an asset. Like now here in the 21st century, everybody has a big TV. Well, back then, you were cool if you had a piano. So having that piano was really the heart of the home, and it was able and capable to do so much more than it did by far in the 16 and 1700s. So when we're talking about articulation, would you consider even things such as having a strong, smooth legato that has, it's finger pedal where you play, lift, right? in order to really connect those notes and playing deep into the keys?
Absolutely. And I'm thinking of Chopin Etude, Opus 10, number 3, really beautiful. If you don't know it, go listen to it.
Yeah,
But
it's
really
beautiful.
beautiful melodic line that you have
Yeah.
to so smoothly connect while playing so many notes underneath. And we
Yeah.
see that sort of articulation come up. I mean, it's really just such a huge variety.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And especially Beethoven, you know, I love Beethoven. He's my favorite. So passionate.
Mm.
And you would have such a loud, like, look up this Beethoven Sonata Opus 10, number 1, right? You've got that rocket theme in the beginning, but then you have this very pastoral part, and he kind of just really lets it all out. One minute he loves you, the next minute he's like, oh, right? But that really creates the dynamic atmosphere to allow fresh ideas of articulation to be explored, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Who's your favorite in the Romantic time period?
Oh my goodness. I've been really excited about Schubert lately.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I've been working my way through the Opus 90 impromptus,
Mm-hmm.
and just such fantastic use of melody, articulation. I mean, Opus 90, number 1, the first impromptu in that set, there's a really incredible section that's sort of played with a detached touch by most pianists, and it sort of calls back to that Baroque period touch. And it's so cool to see that in a Romantic period piece. So
Yeah.
it's another way composers can sort of have a dialogue with the past, as well as all of their visionary ideas as
Right.
well, but making those sorts of callbacks.
Absolutely, because he's arguably the most influential composer that we have, because his music was then tied into Mozart, tied into Beethoven and Chopin. They always took some of his counterpoint ideas and laced them through. So let's think about the contemporary time period.
Ooh,
Yeah.
my favorite.
Yeah. So let's talk about that a little bit. What had happened there?
Oh my goodness.
They were so abusive to piano. They did so many mean things, so many cool new things, but also some like, oh, what did you just do?
Well, I mean, it's true. There's such a spirit of experimentation and innovation that we see in 20th and 21st century music. Even before we quite get there, depending on where you feel Debussy fits in. What a visionary again, and what a great composer to explore articulation with. So a few things Debussy does that I think are great, especially as a student to explore, are again this focus on resonance, on creating maybe some textures with articulation that we haven't really seen so much yet. So if you think about his Sunken Cathedral prelude, we have a lot of really hollow, sort of pale chords. And then at times they grow in intensity and become like bells, like the bells of this cathedral ringing as it rises out of the ocean.
Yeah.
And so much of that is captured through dynamics, but also articulation. So Debussy is pretty great. Very early if we're thinking about contemporary music.
Right.
And then really everything became fair game at a certain point. So you might look at composers like Berio, who has a work called Sequenza 4 for piano. I believe it's 4. And all kinds of completely new articulations. One of my favorites in it is to play a really quick staccato chord, almost just as dry and quick as you can make it, and then you capture the resonance with the pedal.
Wow.
So we don't actually hear any of the initial attack. We only hear all of the release and the cloud of sound that's formed after that. And what a fun thing to play around with and experiment with.
So you're saying the pedal also can make a huge impact on your articulation.
Absolutely. Right. And that's something you can think about certainly with contemporary works, but really pieces from any time period. Deciding whether or not to use pedal in a work by Bach. All right. Deciding how much pedal to use in any particular section of a piece will change your articulations and
Yeah.
change the overall sound.
And the room, right?
And
Every
the room.
single room, depending on the acoustics in the room, the carpet in the room, if there's sound panels, if it's like an older church, sometimes that sound can just get trapped up in the top. You'll have more echo. So maybe you wouldn't use as much pedal, you
Totally.
know?
Yeah.
Yeah, you have to be really sensitive and adapting to that.
That's a really good point. And we talk a lot about that in terms of dynamics.
Mhm.
I find that comes up a lot where if you're playing in a really dry space, meaning the sound just gets sucked up into carpet and curtains and people, whatever happens to be there, um, maybe you have to play with louder dynamics. Well, the same is true for articulation. We really need to be sensitive and always be listening in performance so that we can make those kinds of adjustments.
Yeah.
And the same is true if you're playing in a
Yeah,
cathedral, right?
I
It can
see.
become
Sure.
muddy so quickly. So you
And
might want
what's
to take a more dry approach.
right. And what's difficult is every piano is different. It all behaves differently. The pedals behave differently.
Yeah.
It's not like an instrument where if you have a saxophone, you keep it with you. You're literally going on a brand new instrument in every space.
It's true. And that's all part of the fun,
Right.
right? Always keeps it exciting. Even
Yeah,
if you
yeah,
feel like you've truly mastered a piece
yeah.
and have performed it
Yeah.
for years,
So
well, it's always a surprise.
what about like the 21st century? Like the really like current stuff. What is articulation like with that?
Oh, wow. Well, if we go really out there, because of course people are composing all kinds of music today in all different styles,
Yeah.
but if we're thinking about the really experimental compositions, um, you might even think about pieces that are played inside the piano. So,
You want to give us some of those?
sure. So, this is maybe an older example, but Henry Cowell is probably the most famous example of a composer who wrote music that's played on the strings of the piano. He has a piece called The Banshee, and in the score, he actually shows us exactly what strings to play and how to play them. So, talking about articulation, he specifies, you know, playing along a string with the tip of your finger versus your fingernail
Yeah.
versus the back of your fingernail. And those all have a different articulation and sound to them.
Yeah.
So if you're looking for something really out there, you can always check out Henry Cowell and explore
Cool.
articulations in a totally new way.
Awesome. Well, Tristan, thank you so much for chatting with me today and for sharing with our audience these really great ideas and concepts to be looking for and aware of in their music.
Yeah, thank
This
you
was
so
great.
much.
You're welcome. Thank you guys for viewing, and we'll see you next time. Bye.